really enjoyed, oops, it's a little bit higher here. All right. Y'all hear me okay there? Okay. Really enjoyed the opportunity to see the school. This is my first visit here. I've known a little bit about Thomas More College over the years, most impressively from a young intern that we had at the center last summer, Anastasia Shanahan, who, let me just tell you, represented your college community so brilliantly. And we are so excited that she will be joining our team professionally when she graduates in the fall. But really congratulations to all of you who are a part of this wonderful college. I am so pleased that we have students here with us tonight and also some community members. I tried to structure my remarks so that it would kind of accommodate different ages. And I would like to begin with one question to some of the older people in the audience. So let me just ask you, how many of you spent a few weeks this past fall completely baffled when young people would just absolutely crack up and laugh every time somebody said the words 6 and 7 together and did a crazy motion like this, right? And I'm going to go ahead and raise my hand there because it really baffled me. Now, how many of you who raised your hands actually looked it up online and still couldn't figure it out, right? So that's also there. So I have 5 children spanning Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and I work with Gen Z women every day. So I am constantly encountering new and occasionally maddening vocabulary like low key, no cap, skibbity, sigma. I mention this because I think it's obvious that Gen Z and Gen Alpha use words, even absurd words, that we don't understand because we don't share the cultural experiences that give those words meaning. And yet, for whatever reason, I don't think it's obvious that the same is true in reverse. That older generations, especially older conservatives, speak a language that today's young people really don't understand. So tonight, I want to talk about what happens to a society when generations share a language but not a reality, and what our responsibility is to hand down wisdom in a way that it can be understood. A few months ago, my Gen Alpha daughter, she's 11 years old, asked my Gen X husband a question at the dinner table. So we were throwing around the word conservative, some of my teenagers at the table, and she's 11 years old, and she said, well, what does that word mean? What does it mean to be a conservative? And my husband gave an answer that I think a lot of us in this room would have given. He launched into an explanation of the 3 pillars of the modern conservative movement. He talked about limited government and free enterprise. He talked about a strong national defense and traditional American values. Now, these pillars mean something very specific to those of us who lived through the Reagan years and saw that problems created by a large, intrusive government and weak foreign policy could be overcome through strong conservative policy. Now, Reagan's tremendous successes included his 1981 tax cut that launched one of the longest periods of economic growth in American history and provided the foundation for the modern conservative movement, shaping the worldview of thousands of baby boomer and Gen X conservatives like me. Today's young people were not even born in the same century as Ronald Reagan. They do not share our memories. Their world looks fundamentally different than the one that shaped us. I remember a conversation I had with a wonderful woman back in 2005. She is a strong conservative, a conservative activist, a very generous donor to conservative causes. And I remember her telling me, Kimberly, liberals and conservatives, we ultimately want the same things for our country. We just disagree on how to get there. I think then, back in 2005, that was largely true. This was not true for the far left, but I think for a lot of the people in our day-to-day life, that was true. It was certainly true of the liberals in my own life, and it was true in the 1990s when I was in college. Now, when I was in college, I was a part of the college Republicans, and some of my closest friends were college Democrats. The reason being because we cared about the same things. We cared deeply about people and policy, and we genuinely wanted to build a better society where all people could flourish. Now, we disagreed on public policy, but we went to parties together, and we had crushes on each other, and we even dated each other. That world is unimaginable today. I recently saw a tweet about how conservative Yale law students won't join the Federalist Society out of fear that none of their female classmates will date them if they out themselves as conservative. So what has changed over the years? Well, we don't date people we think are evil. We don't even entertain friendship with them. Recent surveys show that nearly half of Americans believe the other party, meaning Republicans if they're Democrats, or the Democrats if they're Republican, are not just wrong, but evil. This explains the rise in what Charlie Kirk last spring called assassination culture, where normal Americans are increasingly supportive of political violence. A poll from a few months ago found that 30% of Americans say violence may be necessary to get our country back on track. I'll say that again. 30% of Americans said violence may be necessary to get our country back on track. That's shocking, but wait till you hear this statistic. A poll from September found that 12% of Americans said the murder of Charlie Kirk was justified. Now, Charlie Kirk was 31 years old when he was murdered in cold blood on a college campus. Charlie was a husband, a father of 2 young children. He was probably his generation's most powerful advocate for conservative values. He was a law-abiding citizen. He was murdered for engaging in the most American activity there is, participating in the free exchange of ideas on a college campus. In the days following his assassination, Gen Z and Gen Alpha watched as normal people with normal jobs, elementary school teachers, college administrators, nurses, celebrated his murder in a deeply disturbing display of virtue signaling. This is an evil that many of us older conservatives can't quite wrap our heads around. But for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it feels normal. And it is not the only evil that feels normal to them. They lived through the world's response to the COVID pandemic. They were told to, quote, trust the science by propagandists and hypocrites. Their schools were closed even as liquor stores and pet stores stayed open. And people like Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi faced no consequences for not following their own rules. To participate in normal life, they had to carry masks around with them everywhere they went, and to put them on and take them off in between exempted activities like eating. Most egregiously, they were forced to receive an experimental mRNA shot that neither protected them because they were not at risk from the virus, nor prevented transmission to others because that was never a goal of the companies that built the shots. All while its manufacturers collected more than $100 billion in revenue, one of the largest largest pharmaceutical windfalls in history. Now, while all of this was unfolding, they were also living through one of the most disorienting cultural upheavals in history, the rapid rise of the transgender movement that preyed on their generation. And once again, they were pressured to ignore reality, here even ignoring the most basic reality of humanity, male and female, as a billion-dollar medical industry profited from it. So the lesson many young people learned was not that leaders can sometimes be wrong, it was that no lie, no matter how damaging or implausible, is off limits. This reminds me of a story Paula Scanlon told at our Washington, D.C. summit last year. Now, if you're not familiar with Paula Scanlon, she is a remarkable young woman. She was a Division I NCAA swimmer for the University of Pennsylvania when her coaches told her to welcome a new swimmer on their team. He was a man, his name was Will Thomas, but he was going by the name Leah Thomas. And the swimmers on the team were told by their coaches that they were to make room for this man, not only in their locker rooms, but also to take one of the coveted spots in the competition on their team. Now, it turns out that Will was much more successful on the women's team than he was on the men's team. He was ranked in his event 462 in the country when he was competing against men, and he went from 462 in his event all the way to number 1 in his event when he started competing against women. Now, Paula told her parents about all of this while it was happening, and they listened and they supported her, as you might imagine. And then after she graduated, her father told her something that I think we can all relate to. He said he should have responded more strongly when she was sharing with him what was happening on the swim team, but that he couldn't quite process what was happening at the time because it sounded so outrageous and so unbelievable. I think that happened on some level to many of us because we had lived decades when it was unthinkable that a man competing on a women's sports team would be normalized. For Gen Z and Gen Alpha, though, it did not feel shocking. It felt like one more example of a world that already did not make sense. And they experienced it as a generation more isolated than any before it, growing up in smaller, more fractured families, and spending more time alone than any previous generation in the history of the world. Now, when I was at Young America's Foundation for many years working with college students, there was a Ronald Reagan quote that we used all the time that I always really liked because it explained why our work with young people mattered. President Reagan said, "There is a flickering spark in all of us, which if struck at just the right age, can light up the rest of our lives." Now, I'm sure that you see this all the time with the students that you work with at Thomas More College. I certainly see it in the young women that I work with at the Luce Center, and I see it in my own children. The flickering spark is an excitement to grapple with ideas, to philosophize, and to make plans for the future rooted in what one thinks is important and exciting about the life ahead. The natural order has always been that one generation hands off hard-earned wisdom to the next. That responsibility doesn't exist only inside our families, it belongs to our communities and to society as a whole. It's why places like Thomas More College and the Luce Center exist. But if we accept that responsibility, we also have to accept the obligation to do it well. And that requires humility, the willingness to speak in ways young people can actually hear, rather than simply repeating the words and arguments that persuaded us that we think ought to persuade them. Over the last few weeks, I have had the pleasure of interviewing young women from across the country who are applying for our internship. And I have used this opportunity to ask them, because they consider themselves conservatives, they identify as conservative, they use that word themselves. So I've asked them, what does it mean to you to be a conservative? First, I want to share what they did not say. None of them used the words limited government. None of them said free markets. None of them said a strong national defense. Instead, they talked about not wanting to lie to fit in. They talked about wanting stable families. They talked about the real differences between men and women. In other words, they were telling me their conservatism is not policy-based, it is reality-based. They were starting with their lived experiences and searching for language that described it. A few months ago, Ben Shapiro gave a talk at TPUSA's AmFest that ties our students' answers together. He said, quote, "Our first duty is truth. We owe you the truth." I like Ben's answer because it's the message we've been leading with at the Luce Center. When people ask what conservative values are, I usually say they're American values rooted in faith and freedom. This is a fair question, but it's not the most important question, because it is not values that shape and strengthen a nation, but it is the human beings who embrace those values courageously who shape and strengthen a nation. So the more important question that we talk about a lot at the Luce Center is, what does it mean to be a conservative? And the definition that we use applies equally to men as it does to women. We say that a conservative has a zeal for truth, an appreciation for tradition, and a passion for human flourishing and societal flourishing, rooted in a love of faith, family, and freedom. So while the three pillars that my husband talked to my 11-year-old so passionately about just a few months ago may have been the best framework for policy-focused young people like me in the 20th century, I think today's young people need a framework that acknowledges their reality and speaks to their instincts as truth seekers who want to live authentically and live well and truly thrive in the world. Today's young people are tired of being lied to and being managed like pawns in someone else's chess game. The conservative movement has been experiencing a bit of an identity crisis lately. This is not a surprise. Our last three Republican presidents have been Donald Trump, twice over the last 10 years, George W. Bush more than 20 years ago, and George H.W. Bush, right, more than 30 years ago. The years are flying by for us. My generation, Gen X, is the last to have known Ronald Reagan as our president. We inherited the modern conservative movement from conservative baby boomers. But our kids are Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and we are now hiring and working alongside Gen Z every day. And that gives us, Gen X, some unique insights. I will tell you, I have great affection for Gen Z. I always say they are realists and dreamers because of their unique formative experiences, and also because they want to chart their own path rooted in purpose and common sense. They are not interested in fighting their parents' battles, and they're really not interested in fighting their grandparents' battles either. They really don't care about the disagreements between conservatives and libertarians, social conservatives and economic conservatives, neocons and paleocons. They don't know what those words mean, and they really don't want to know. What they want is to live well and live authentically. At the Luce Center, we did a poll of 800 young women, ages 18 to 24, And what we found is that today's young women want what they have always wanted: a happy life enriched by the support of a happy and healthy family, friends, and community. Like previous generations, they want to have a family. This goes for even the young women who identify as liberal, by the way. Our survey found that most young women, even those who identify as liberal, want to be married and want to have at least one child by the time they're 30. So like previous generations, they want to have a family, they want to get a good job and own their own home, and they want to be happy. At the same time, they see how difficult life is today. Consider a few statistics about the world young people inhabit. Today, only about half of adults are married. 4 in 10 babies are born out of wedlock. 4 in 10 marriages end in divorce. The typical first-time home buyer is now about 40 years old. First-time buyers now make up just about 1/5 of home purchases, the lowest level ever recorded, down from roughly 2/5 a generation ago. A home costs about 5 times the average income. And there are the mental health statistics. Nearly half of Gen Z say they often or always feel anxious. About 1 in 5 say they often or always feel depressed. Today's young people are seeking solutions that reflect their reality. Meanwhile, many older conservatives are communicating the way we always have. Perhaps the best example of this is the use of our word freedom. When we say freedom, we think freedom from oppressive government. Reagan's triumph over Soviet communism and bureaucratic overreach. But many young people today hear freedom and they think our anything goes culture and everything that comes with it. Kids identifying as furries, classmates watching and acting out violent pornography, school clubs for Satan worshipers, cannabis dispensaries on every corner, siblings frozen in time through IVF and lost forever to abortion, suicide for the anxious, sick, old, and forgotten. So the word that inspires us can sound to them like abandonment, the removal of Chesterton's fence without bothering to find out why it was put up or who it was protecting. Another word we use that lands differently without our shared experiences is feminism. A lot of older conservatives use this word to criticize Marxist attacks on the family in the 20th century and the redefinition of women's rights to mean the removal of legal protection for babies in the womb, and the pitting of women against men and their children. This is understandable. A lot of older conservatives see the breakdown of the family and the breakdown of moral standards as the natural outgrowth of this dangerous ideology, and we rightfully want to warn young women and young men against it. But for many of today's young people, the word simply means support for women and their ordinary rights, like equal protection under the law. So when conservatives attack feminism broadly, many young people don't hear a critique of a dangerous ideology. They hear a rejection of women themselves and a rejection of women's dignity. We have to be even more careful about the words we use to today's younger generation, because it is easier than ever for them to tune us out. On message volume alone, we are at a huge disadvantage. Today's young people live in a hybrid world where they are constantly connected to each other and consuming online content through devices. The typical young person spends 6 hours a day on the phone and 9 hours a day on screens overall. The algorithm gives them what they like, not what is good for them, not what will help them see the world clearly and live a good, meaningful life that will lift up their fellow man. Who they listen to most are peers and peer influencers who share the same cultural experiences and use language that matches their reality. What should give us hope is that the truth still resonates. It really is written on the human heart. It's just for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it's written in a different language than the one we are used to speaking. Our task is to make that truth recognizable again. It will take humility and honesty, and some of us won't like it, but I promise you it will be worth it. I will end with one of my favorite stories, and this is not the first time I have ended a talk with this story, but it always seems to fit somehow. Once, a newspaper asked G.K. Chesterton what is wrong with the world today. He replied simply, "Dear sirs, I am." I think if we begin there, with the humility to change ourselves first, we can learn to speak truth in a way the upcoming generations can finally understand. And with that, I'd be very happy to take some questions, and I hope to take some from Gen Z and also maybe some from Gen X and some baby boomers too. So thank you. Yes.
Can you go over the ages of Gen Z and Gen Alpha?
So yes, I can very easily because there is a divide in my house, and my last Gen Zer is so proud she's a Gen Z and that she's older and a different generation than my Gen Alphas. So Gen Z right now is about 14 and up until probably about the late 20s,
Okay.
and Gen Alpha is about 13 and under.
Okay.
I should have asked actually when I started, how many Gen Zs are here? Let me see. Okay. Any millennials? Okay, we have two millennials.
Is that 81 to,
What's that?
what were the years from, was it 81?
Millennials,
81
let's see.
to 2005.
The millennials are right between Gen X and Gen
Is that 81?
95. 95, okay. So how many baby boomers are here?
I have to look what I don't know all the names. Like, what about 70s, like early 70s?
You're probably Gen X with me.
Oh.
You look like we're Gen X. But the reason that we care about what the generation is called is because we truly are shaped by the culture around us and by our generational experiences. I certainly see it in my own children, and I see it in the young women that we're mentoring at the Luce Center. And I really do think that it's a responsibility of those of us who are trying to pass on wisdom to the younger generation to be able to understand what it is that they're going through that's very different than what we experienced at the same age. And to understand that what shaped us and what was persuasive to us might not necessarily be persuasive to them. Because if our aim is to really help them, I think we have to do it by understanding that their reality of the world that they're living in really is very different than the reality of the world that we were brought up in.
So what do you say with the kind of abuse of language that has occurred, or the downgrading? So because I don't want to say, okay, we can't use this word anymore, because that seems like a concession that, you've won, because you've devalued the word freedom or whatever it is. But I remember, I was teaching a course called Literature and the Moral Imagination. We were reading Russell Kirk, and he was talking about the normative consciousness. And this word normal or normative was like students were allergic to it. Because it was shocking to me. Again, it was one of those moments where I thought we were speaking the same language, and then because it had been so hammered into them that you have to accept something that isn't normal and call it normal. And so they were, rightly suspicious of someone using that word just as a kind of default setting. So, but, my view was, okay, we need to rehabilitate it and rehabilitate the word to to mean what it should mean, what it does mean, what it's intended to mean, so that the works of the past don't mean something different to them.
Mhm.
Do you see what I'm saying?
I see exactly what you're saying, and it's an excellent point, and I think you have to know your audience, and I think that you can explore different words, and you can, on a day-to-day basis in a small class like that, I think that you can work with young people, and you can earn their trust, and you can help them become more comfortable using words properly. But I think, so for us, Anastasia could tell you that we take young women and work with them from all different kinds of backgrounds. And graduates of a program like this at Thomas More College, where they're getting a very rich liberal arts education, they're gonna understand words in a way that's different than some of the kids coming out of some of the secular programs, some of the state schools where there's no study in classic literature, or there's no study in theology or philosophy. And so, I think we do have to accept that we are going to have to acknowledge that there's going to be less familiarity with words like freedom. Actually, one of the questions that I really like asking a lot of the young women when they're applying for our internship is, what does the word freedom mean to you? And the answer that we get, as you can imagine, are all very, very different. But I also like to ask, where do you think your rights come from? For whatever it's worth, even the conservatives, most of them don't tell me that their rights come from God. Most of the girls who call themselves conservative will tell me, well, their rights come from our founding documents. And they'll say the Constitution, they'll actually sometimes just say, well, they come from, a cooperation with government and understanding what those rights are. But, to say that it's shocking what young people don't know, I think you probably know that the schools have been a disaster for a long time, the government schools. And so I think that as conservatives, we love our understanding of the world. We love to be able to talk about the modern conservative movement and women in government and freedom and some of these wonderful concepts that were so persuasive to us. But I think it's really important that we don't let stubbornness and sort of, a pride get in our way of being able to really help these young people. And I think I've come to realize, the older I've gotten and the more that I've worked with young people, that we really do have to be focused like a laser beam on how to help these kids and how to help them see the world clearly. And language right now is a barrier to them, because your education and my education has been very different than the education these young people have been getting. And they are spending their days on TikTok and Instagram, and they are just learning about the world in a way that is completely foreign to the way that we learned about the world. And in order to help them, we have to figure out how to get their attention and how to break through that noise. And I think that the very first step in that process has to be humility and being able to confront the reality of their experiences and really challenging ourselves to kind of get over whatever expectations that we have for this generation and really work on how to communicate with them directly.
Thank you for being here this evening. Generation X, by the way. I was thinking as you were going through this, some of our failures, I don't think of myself as older generation, but maybe relative to these guys. We have a responsibility, yes, to teach. We failed. We have a responsibility to inform, right? Failures there. But maybe the greatest failure is the failure to form. Failure to form. And you touched on it, and I maybe just want to tug at that string a little bit more, because the idea that any of my children or the people for whom I have responsibility to form would listen to an influencer is a huge failure in my mind, right? That maybe older generations would say, why in the world would you listen to so-and-so? And maybe it's not that simple, but it does seem like that is one of the largest failures then of those generations who have been charged with the responsibility to form others in a way that says, no, I reject an influencer on its very premise. I don't know, any remarks or comments on that?
Yeah, so many comments. As parents, we have the most responsibility to our children, right? And so we should be protecting them from the peer influencers. To allow those devices into our homes and into our children's bedrooms, where they are consuming this content, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a day is extremely irresponsible. There's been no comparison in the history of the world with the irresponsibility of parents in the formation of their children, like what we're seeing in the modern day today. So as parents, we actually have a lot of control over what we do. But our children are going to be encountering others in the world who are formed in the way that the rest of the culture is being formed. And that word formation, I think it means something very real to those of us who are here. I know because you're here. And if you're attending a lecture like this, you care about the formation of young people. The truth is that a lot of the culture out there, this is not a word that is recognized as important or really even a consideration of a lot of families. So if you talk to a lot of parents about their kids' future, they're going to go right to job. I mean, they might go to college first, right? So college and career readiness as a goal of education. But they're not thinking in terms of faith formation, of virtue formation, of the cultivation of wonder, so that you're equipped to be a lifelong learner and to be bettering yourself and to be pursuing excellence in all areas of your life. The truth is that this is just not a goal of many American families. The goals really are so that you can get into a college and then you can get a good job, and it kind of ends there. So to talk to families about the importance of them forming their young people, their kids, they're going to be thinking in terms of, well, how is this going to affect their prospects of getting into college, and how is this going to affect their prospects of getting a good job? But the problem is that the parents themselves didn't receive the kind of formation that they needed to be on alert as much as is needed, so that they really realize how dangerous the peer influencers and these phones really are, and how much it is preventing young people from not just becoming excellent in all areas of their lives, but just really from being fully human anymore and experiencing the range of human experiences and human emotions that we all would want for our children. So I continue to think formation is pretty much the most important thing. The reason I do the work that I do at the Luce Center every single day is I cannot imagine more important work for me personally, and also more satisfying work than forming the next generation of young people. And for me, it's the work with young women. I truly believe that conservative women, faithful conservative women, are the trustees of a free and flourishing America. So I think formation is hugely important. And I think, again, it's a little bit of a language thing, because we talk about formation and we know what that means. But I think that, you step outside of our liberal arts circles, our faithfully Catholic circles, and that word does not mean a whole lot in the broader culture anymore.
Gen Z. It wasn't obvious. You mentioned the statistic on the 30%. And I was curious about that because you also mentioned the sort of spark I guess I'm just wondering, if you have a group of people who are by their age disposed naturally to be fiery, and that sort of fieriness in them is being whipped up constantly by just all of the things going on and people taking advantage and exasperating those things, and then their peers who are also exasperating those things. Doesn't it, at least to me, it seems almost impossible for that sort of fire and all of them not to sort of be building towards an explosion almost. And I don't know, it seems like almost an inevitability that it's going to end poorly if you have a large group of young, strong, healthy, zealous people who are so polarized. I guess my question is there, from the older generation's point of view, does there actually seem to be a sense of hope that this isn't going to get ugly fast? Because as someone in Gen Z, it seems like there's inevitably going to be a lot worse before there's any chance of it getting better, and that's going to terrify. I guess that's my question. From an older generation perspective, does it seem possible to hope for things not to have to be resolved?
I think so. Something that I have realized, the more the older that I've gotten, is that, truth is a real thing, the truth really is written in our hearts. And there is a reason that we all understand that, for the most part, murder is wrong. And that, bravery and kindness and generosity is good. Morality is an objective standard that it takes a lot of work to distort that in the human brain and the human heart. We all know that that is very possible. But we also know that it is a natural condition of the human person to want to strive to be good and to admire goodness. And I think that what we all need to do is become a little bit more courageous in calling out evil and praising the good and holding not just our young people but our peers to standards and saying that this is the moral code, this is the moral law, and I will operate within it, and I will require everybody that I'm working with, all members of my family, my friends, if my friends are operating outside the moral code, that I will be courageous enough to point that out. I think just as toddlers, just as little kids, they really want boundaries. I think that never stops being true. I think that's for teenagers. I think it's for college kids, young people in their 20s. They want the boundaries. They want that kind of order. And yes, it makes it much more difficult when you're in a peer group that is, for example, celebrating the murder of a good, honest man who is courageously speaking out, but in kindness for conservative principles. So I think what the answer really is just like the G.K. Chesterton story, I think we all have to start taking a little bit more responsibility for our actions out in the broader world and to say, this is evil, I call the evil out, I won't stand for it anymore, I'm not going to stay silent. I'm going to hold myself to a higher standard, and I'm going to hold the other people to higher standards too. I do think that there is hope. I know it's not looking good right now, and the political violence and the support for political violence is extremely upsetting. But, I know that the truth will prevail, and I know that there are a lot of good and courageous people out there, and I think that the way that we encourage others to be courageous is to find them and to give them support. And there's no reason that each and every one of us can't do more of that, giving support to the people in our lives to encourage goodness to spread and to start calling out evil and just start preventing it and giving more young people the kind of guidance that they crave.
I guess as a sort of follow-up to that, you mentioned the Kirby example, and at least from the experience of my life and what I saw among my peers on, not my personal peers, but my peers on, as in people my age that I saw online, a lot of them just reacted to that with, we've tried words, they answered with bullets. Why should we keep trying words and not respond with bullets? And it seems like that reaction is becoming more and more common. So I guess my question is my follow-up question would be like, how do you say to a person who says that, I think partially justly so, no, we have to keep operating in a moral way, and the other side is killing us? Because that is, at least from what I've seen, the mindset a lot of young people like myself have, that they're shooting us. We can't keep trying to talk to them because they don't care and they just want to kill us. And they dehumanize us and they don't see us as human. And so it's very difficult to have a conversation with somebody who wants you dead. So I guess the follow-up would be, how do you convince somebody that this person who wants them dead and sees them as not just less than human, but as a monster and a devil, can be reached with words?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think the answer is you live your life. I'm not recommending that we try to convert every person that we see out on the street, for sure. I think that there are moments when you're in conversation that you can show courage and share your real beliefs on a certain matter. But I think for the most part, it's really just about living your life well. Making sure that you are living your faith truly, that you're putting first things first, that you're putting God and your duties to God above everything else, and then your duties to your family above everything else. And living your life in a way that is attractive. When I was in college, I was away from the faith, basically from the time I was in high school all through college, like so many young people. Had absolutely no interest in Catholicism, no interest in Christianity. It wasn't until I was in my 20s, doing things everyone in their 20s does, and having my job and doing the bar scene and all of that, and I had this friend in my life I really admired, and the reason I admired her is because she was so good. I felt good around her, and she came to my little studio apartment one Sunday after a wild night of partying, and she said, you should come to church with me. You should come to church. And I thought, gosh, that sounds like the most boring thing in the whole world. I don't want to go to church, but I really like Jen, and she said I could go to dinner with her afterwards, and I really wanted to go to dinner with Jen. So I said, fine. So we went to Mass at 5, and then we had dinner afterwards. And we did the exact same thing every Sunday for a few weeks. And the only reason I went is because there was this goodness in her. And I was attracted to that goodness in her. And I wanted to have dinner with her. And then one Sunday, she was going to visit her family. And I went to Mass by myself without her, without even the promise of having dinner with her. And guess who was at that Mass? My husband. Saw me at the back of the room and then bumped into me at the Metro 3 days later and said, don't you go to St. Charles? Even though I'd only been gone for a few weeks. I said, yes, I do. But the point is, we're attracted to goodness. And I think that just living your life and just yourself operating within that moral law and trying to be good, it will attract others to you. So I don't think the answer, as much as I'm all about courage, I've always been all about moral courage, but I think that it's not the arguments, the debates, the discussions that's necessarily going to convert the rest of the world. It's the very basically living your life well and
that's a word we should try to reclaim and redefine, and if yes, how?
Everybody has a different opinion on this. I have found that I used to use the word a lot, and I used it critically, because to me, feminism was this Marxist ideology that was pitting women against men and pitting women against their own babies, right? Making them at war with their own babies. So women either have to choose, a life of happiness and success, or, or a life of motherhood, where a woman doesn't get to pursue all of her hopes and dreams, when in actuality, all of us that are mothers out there know that it is through motherhood that we feel most alive and we feel most fulfilled. So I think for a lot of years I was very critical of feminism and used the word in a way that made it very clear that I was critical of this Marxist ideology. I no longer use the word, and it's because I've realized that a lot of young women and young men too understand it more as a representation of women's dignity and women's rights. And from some of the rhetoric that I'm seeing right now on me, so-called right, and I don't consider these people to be on the right, but they're not necessarily on the left. But there are, some people who consider themselves to be conservatives or consider themselves to be on the right today, who are saying some really alarming things about women. And I think that a lot of young women, it's no surprise that young women have moved sharply to the left in recent years. And I can't help but think that they listen to some of the rhetoric that they're hearing from people who call themselves conservative and think, I want absolutely no part of that. What has happened with the transgender movement is, for a number of years, we had leftists telling us that, gender fluidity was a thing, and that actually you could be a man one day and a woman the next day and kind of go back and forth, so there was no meaningful difference between men and women. And conservatives rightly said, of course there are differences between men and women, but what has happened is that pendulum has swung so far that before we were saying that, not only is there no difference between men and women, but now we're saying, no, actually there are differences between men and women, and they're actually opposites. That's not true either. We share a humanity that is more important than our differences. And that distinction has been lost by a lot of people who consider themselves to be conservative or who say that they're on the right. We're now seeing some people say that men and women are basically opposites. That, men are the leaders and women are the followers and men are the thinkers, and women are, basically no better than wombs and kitchen workers. And this is something that I have been noticing increasingly for a few years now. And I will tell you that faculty at some really excellent Catholic schools have told me that they are seeing a shift, yes, in the attitudes of their young men now. And this is shocking, because I've been watching all of this go on X for a few years, and I have been wondering, is this seeping in? Is this having an effect on our young people? And I will tell you, the answer is it is having an effect. I have talked to the teachers at some excellent Catholic schools, and they have told me that lessons they taught a few years when they're talking about women's suffrage, that there is a lot more skepticism and outright opposition to women's suffrage, especially among some teenage boys, than there used to be. And there is a lot more questioning of why women need an education today than there used to be. No matter, by the way, that if you want your children to be educated, their mother should probably be educated as well. And there is less of an understanding of women's intelligence and dignity. And so I see all of these things happening. I'm very concerned about them. I think that our words are very loaded. And so what I try to do when I speak to young women is, rather than use words that we might have different understanding of, different definition, I try to just talk to the core and not use those larger descriptive words like feminism. I know that some people say we need a new word to describe what it means to be a woman, a woman who flourishes out there in the world. I think just saying that you want to be a woman is probably enough. And I don't personally use the word feminism. I know that a lot of people want to take it back and want to say, well, to be a feminist is just to be an excellent woman. But I think I've come to the conclusion that we just have to be realists about the language barriers between generations.
Is really what today is really the utility of the term conservative in the first place. Generation Z, they often see around them just frankly the absolute rot of every institution. I mean, Generation Z is not going to be able to cash in on Social Security the way it's structured. We simply will not. And yet we pay into it, and we pay all sorts of taxes for services we really might not be able to have access to when it comes time. This is just one example. Furthermore, for example, Reaganism, Reaganomics, these are things often lambasted by Generation Z. They feel like they often might have been failed at that moment. These sort of collapse of capitalism into this sort of oligarchy with sort of Silicon Valley and all these things are our food is poison, these sorts of things that people blame on capitalism. People don't think there's much left to conserve. And it's really, and it feels like for a lot of young people that more of an offensive and more action and more creation and innovation is required than would be any sort of conservative action, any sort of defensive. Again, it doesn't feel like often there's much left to defend. As a person who has asked this question myself before, what use is there in still identifying as a conservative?
Well, one way to look at it, we tend to think of things as binary, and we tend to think of things as opposites, and I think that there are, some real drawbacks to that. But it is helpful to be able to distinguish ourselves from the left. And if you're opposed to the left, what is the force for good that is challenging the left over here? And when I'm talking about the left, I'm talking about the Marxist left. Marxist meaning that you're seeing the world of basically oppressor versus oppressed, and in every single social dynamic there is an oppressor group that is making everything harder for the oppressed group. But there's this Marxist worldview that has really pit people against each other for years. When I talk about the left, I'm talking about the atheistic left. The left that believes that either there is no God or that is just actively opposed to all of the good that is coming from God in the world. It is a left that wants to coerce activity and wants collectivism in a way that does not allow individual creativity and ingenuity to take hold, and that wants to control for the benefit of a select few to advance their own bigger agendas that have nothing to do with the individual flourishing of people in society. So we sort of need some word to describe the force that is challenging and working to defeat that. I think conservative as a word works because I think what we want to conserve is the goodness in this society that values faith and family and freedom. When you're saying that your generation thinks that there's nothing worth conserving, to be fair, a lot of that I think is coming from the fact that your reality has been very different than ours has been. Again, if you're looking at Ronald Reagan, you don't have the same feelings that the Gen X conservatives do about Ronald Reagan because you did not see this heroic man taking these conservative principles that were out there in theory and putting them into practice in the 1980s and showing that we can actually improve society and help people. You know, my generation looks at this man, Ronald Reagan, and thinks how amazing it was that, you know, he courageously took these conservative principles and, you know, applied them to rein in government excesses and to defeat Soviet communism, to spread freedom throughout the world. And it was a really tremendous victory. You know, he improved people's lives. And so there was a whole generation of people, me included, who thought, wow, through conservative public policy, we can help people. And I understand that your generation has no experience with that. And I respect that. But I don't think that you should assume that because you haven't had experience with it, that there's nothing good to conserve there. Because as a country, we have a really remarkable set of principles here that are built on freedom and built on respecting the individual rights of our citizens. And it has inspired generations of Americans, and there's a reason that so many of us feel a real love and patriotism for this country. Honestly, the way that Charlie Kirk felt about America. And I might ask you to, you know, maybe ask some of the other Gen Xers or baby boomers or other conservatives about what it is that they think that is worth conserving, because I do think that there's still a lot to conserve there.
So Gen Z, and I've observed in my own generation even among those who consider themselves more conservative or more right-wing generally, there's a hostility towards the fact that so much of our government is dominated by particularly the baby boomer generation. The vast majority of our political class is over the age of 60. And in particular, looking at major world leaders, Russia, China, and the United States, their leaders are all over the age of 70. And so I've seen some assessment that there might be positive change simply by waiting, that basically by letting the walking corpses fall down, as it were, that somehow this will fix things. And I suppose my question is, to what degree do you consider that true? Is there a part of the current problem of the world that is simply driven by the generation currently in charge of it? A generation that, to my own observation and from talking with some of them, doesn't believe there is a real future in the world. It's like, I think one of the things that has fascinated me greatly in my study of the time before I was born is 1999, the year Y2K, the sense of the end of history, and this idea that, especially with the invention of the internet, that humans had kind of reached their apex, and we were just sort of going to trot through a period of consistent, gentle technological improvement, and that's not quite panned out in a lot of ways. We see new products come out, but not necessarily new technologies. All the, even AI is just sort of a, recombination of the same algorithms that were, discovered, that got us to the moon, really. So, yeah, I guess how much of what we're currently dealing with in the world is due to that, and certainly I think an effort must be made towards, care of the upcoming generations, to the degree that we conform, that Gen Z conform itself and form its peers. And then, when we start having children and start raising them, working towards that's certainly critical. But how much of it, is there a degree to which we're living through a dark time because of what's happened in the past, and it's going to get better even without our direct action?
I think I understand your question. One thing I will say is that Gen X, I touched on this a little bit, I think we really are in this very unique position because we have learned from the older generation. That wisdom has been passed on to us. Before all the things happened that, Gen Z has been a part of, before the smartphones and, our education was a little bit more stable, we were formed a little bit better, we understood virtue a little bit better. Faith was passed on to us a little bit more. But we're also having Gen Z and Gen Alpha kids, and we're hiring Gen Z young men and young women, and so I think we're a little bit closer to them and we understand them, perhaps a little bit better than the baby boomers do. And I know from many conversations with baby boomers, there is a real reluctance sometimes to understand, and there's, I guess there is a little bit of a lack of humility, I think, in saying, this is what worked for us, this is what's always going to work for every single generation that comes after us. And the truth is that that's just not true. This new generation, I think, really does have some unique challenges and also some unique opportunities. There's no question that the world has really changed. And I think that Gen X, from the other, Gen Xers that I talk to, with their Gen Z and their Gen Alpha kids, and in workplaces with a lot of Gen Z hires, I think that there is a little bit more of a willingness to work with these young people, not to ignore the differences in language and not pass on eternal truths, which I think we should always be doing, but to just be willing to work with them in just a very real sense, where we're very, very clear that what the goal is to help them thrive, that the goal is not to get our own way and to make sure that our point of view wins. What's more important here? That our point of view wins, and that what was persuasive to me and the words that I used, or is it more important to make sure that the upcoming generation is really, truly allowed to thrive? And I think that's the decision that, my generation needs to make when it comes to the upcoming generations.
Boomer here. I'm going to start with an example that you gave about when I was in college, even probably more so than you, that I would have a lot of friends that were liberal, but you never insulted each other because then the idea is you were a fool if you did. You couldn't, certainly not that vitriol that comes out now, much less the assaults that happen. And I'm an activist and I get assaulted a lot, and that group, from my generation a little older, that would learn civility, they're the worst now. You give them signs, they scream at you and they yell at you. And I've also been working a whole lot with young people in their around 20, 21, 22, and I find I have a lot in common with them. And as I'm listening to the forces that you described, social media and watching COVID, there's also, we can throw in 1 out of 25 high school seniors who smoke marijuana. Marijuana is huge, and video games. And to what extent are the same things that are making young people idiots, making us all idiots? And in which case, then is it a matter of uniting sane and clear-headed people as opposed to looking to protect particular generations?
Yeah, That's an excellent point. At dinner this evening, we were sort of talking about how much the world has changed and how respect for disagreement and the need for other people to think exactly the same way that you do on everything, in your personal life, politics, professionally, just how this is a very new phenomenon. And I think you're right, that I think social media is a cause for it, and you're right, it's not just affecting the young people, I think it's affecting all of us. And I think that the fix is to get off as much of the social media as we possibly can, and again, to live our lives with other human beings, and actually to do things like this. I mean, what you're doing here, to have different speakers come in, and you're gathering in person instead of just being on your screens, I think is hugely important. And I think as human beings, we need to bring back just real social opportunities and real conversations where you look somebody in the eye and you talk to them and you're happy for their successes, and you talk about the little things, the small talk, and you talk about the big things too, in a way where you're still understanding their humanity and you care about them on a personal level. So I think you're right, it's not necessarily a generational thing. I do think it is helpful to understand that we all have different memories, that I have memories that you don't have, and that, you know, when we go through a certain thing in our formative years really does matter. And I do think the transgender movement targeting this generation, I think, was devastating to them. And I also think that being targeted by COVID policies that clearly were not in their best interest has really hardened a lot of Gen Z. But you're right, I think that we all need to be vigilant in making sure that we're not affected by these technologies out there that do not have our best interests at heart.
Thank you, Kimberly. This is very good. This might sound like it's out of left field and maybe too abstract, but what have you thought about the role of, I'm going back to some earlier questions about formation and then that led to some anger. Have you thought about the role of the development of humor and a sense of humor in formation, or even culturally, how humor plays a role in formation? At least as a parent, that's been an important thing that my wife and I have tried to cultivate, is how you cultivate humor that's not derisive, but actually becomes a way of sharing joy, but also does create a certain kind of detachment from the seriousness of all of this. Like, everything seems so serious, but a lot of it isn't that serious, it turns out. So I don't know if you've thought about that, like kind of cultural way of formation, what the role of humor is in all of this.
I love that very much, and I want to talk first about joy and then maybe go into humor. I am a huge, huge believer in joy. I think that we're talking about what it is that parents want for their kids. What every parent wants for their kids, you talk to all of them, they want their kids to go to a good college, they want them to get a good job. They never talk about the joy in their kids' life. I had a good friend years ago who was really into Montessori education, and she gave me some of the best advice that I ever received as a parent. She said, you have to fill your kids' buckets, and you fill their joy buckets, and you figure out what it is that they love to do, and it's the best way. Instead of dealing with problems as they arise, you avoid the problems when you figure out what it is that the desires that God puts on your kids' hearts, the special talents that He gives your children. You figure out how to actually allow your children to experience that joy, and you avoid a lot of the problems, a lot of the anxiety and depression that you see out there. Kids do not have opportunities to have fun anymore, to have real joy. The arts, my goodness, we don't do arts with kids anymore at all. I have children who love the arts, something that we discovered many years ago with our, my second born, was that when he was 5 years old, we discovered that he loved to perform. And so he and all of my kids under him something that we've given him opportunities to do. He said to me maybe 3-4 months ago, he said, Mom, if I didn't have singing, I don't even know what I would do. I don't know what I would be. He got very dramatic, and he said, I think I'd be, suicidal at one point. He's a theater kid. He's suicidal. I think I'd want to kill myself. But his point was that this had given him something that he loves, that he can do, on his own, and he can do with friends communally. His friend group is largely, different boys that he goes and sings with, right? They went to a senior home not that long ago and sang, and he told me it was like the best day of his life, like singing to older people in a senior home, because he got to be with his friends and sing and bring joy to that community. I think joy is hugely important, and almost nobody talks about it. The other thing is, yes, humor. I mean, watching, really fun movies with your kids. My 19-year-old, his favorite movie is The Producers. You know what I'm talking about? Oh my gosh, he loves that movie. But seeing like your kid laugh so hard at a movie, something, a creative work that was produced in order to elicit that response of laughter is the greatest thing. Seeing your kids like repeat movie lines that just crack them up around the house is wonderful, and it's a wonderful way to build a family culture. It's funny that one of the reasons I wrote the book Unbreakable was to give parents an easy way to bring the stories of the saints into their homes, because I think building a really healthy culture at home is so important, and something that we almost never talk about, right? I guess in a lot of Catholic circles, I guess we talk about it, maybe not outside of a lot of our Catholic circles. But I think that, bringing stories into the home is hugely important, especially about the saints. But yes, bringing fun and humor and laughter into the home, I think, is also hugely important. And gosh, all we ever talk about is our, political disagreements anymore. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we, talked about, humor and joy and just some of the really pleasurable things in life more.
It seems that Gen Z has some rightly developed skepticism regarding future economics, politics, et cetera, go down the list. One thing I'm just curious, in your experience, do you see them developing skepticism towards the kind of online ecosystem? The reason I ask that is I always find it curious. There is this kind of, I think, a kind of healthy, rightly understood kind of skepticism about the state of things and the condition of things. But it always never ceases to amaze me how they'll gobble up things online and like, oh yeah, I read this article and the comments were unbelievable, and all these liberals just hate us, and I'm going, how do you know who these people are posting this thing? How do you know how do you know this isn't just all these activists it could be one account making all these other comments and, stirring things up, and fake accounts and fake, whatever it is. Do you see any of that skepticism moving into that online ecosystem to not necessarily just digest and believe or trust all the things that they're ingesting or reading, things like that?
Not yet,
Okay.
but I hold out some hope.
Yeah.
This is kind of what they know. This is how they interact. I always say they live in this really weird hybrid world where even when they're with other people, they will be with other people and they will have their phones on them, and they'll be texting while they're on Instagram while they're talking to somebody. And so it's just an extension of who they are, these phones. So I think that the more time that anybody spends in communion with other human beings and experiencing life for real off of screens, I think that is uniquely satisfying. And I think that if they have opportunities to put the phone down and to experience the world that way, they might be able to sort of condition themselves and maybe develop that skepticism. But right now, I don't see it. You know, right now, those phones are just a huge part of who they are. I'd like to see more, not just young people, but, you know, all people. One thing I've started doing in my own life is I had this horrible habit when I couldn't sleep in the middle of the night to like go on X. And I was doing this for, you know, probably a few years, and it occurred to me I never got back to sleep after going on X. It's not a very smart thing that I was doing, so I stopped doing it, and it's fine. Now I fall back to sleep. So you can learn new things, right? So even though I think our young people are kind of attached to these phones all the time, I think if they, through personal experience, learn that they can improve their lives by putting them aside a little bit and having more real experiences out there in the world, you know, maybe the benefits will include